The silence hit like a hand over my mouth. One moment the sanctuary was quiet in that way it always is before the minister's words. Hushed breaths, the soft rustle of hymnals. Then Pastor Bennett raised his hand and nodded toward Thomas. I felt every head turn. My fingers tightened on my handbag until the leather creaked. The pearls at my throat felt suddenly heavy like small, accusing weights. I remember the morning as if it were a painting. Sunlight across the kitchen window, the steam rising from my coffee, the faint smell of cinnamon from the roll I baked the night before. I had tied on my pearls, smoothed my navy dress, lifted my old leather Bible from the shelf where Harold loved to stack his newspapers. The house smelled like cedar and laundry, Harold's shirt still in the closet, and for a moment I felt safe. Then I stepped into the church and that safety evaporated. Thomas came down the aisle with that hesitant, shuffling step of his. You could see it in his shoulders, how he wanted to stop and ask forgiveness but couldn't. He leaned in and spoke. Mrs. Davidson, we need you to move back today. His voice was softer than the carpet under his shoes, but loud enough for the first 2 rows to hear. I felt the warmth rush into my face. The wooden pew under my palms seemed to vibrate, as if remembering every Sunday we had sat there. Baptisms, funerals, school plays. I patted the wood, as if that might anchor me. But my voice faltered. My throat tightened. I could hear the organist tuning a chord in the background, a single note trembling through the air like a question. Orders from the pastor, Thomas said, glancing past me toward the front. His eyes were apologetic. The mayor and some investors. They need these seats today. There it was, a small rustle of papers, a suppressed laugh like someone clearing their throat. Susan Williams looked away. Darlene pretended to rearrange a penciled list in her purse. Only Rebecca met my eyes, and in her face I saw the shock I felt mirrored, soft, open, like a palette of sound that hadn't yet learned to hide. I stood. The aisle felt longer than ever. My hat brushed the stained glass window as I passed. The light threw colors across my cheek, greens and reds like old hymnbook pages. Each step made the floorboards remember Harold's heavier strides. I felt the grain under my palm where I steadied myself. People moved aside with small, polite gestures that said everything without saying a word. At the back I found a spot near the rear door, where the teenagers usually congregate. The air there smelled faintly of winter coats and damp wool. I sank into the bench and felt the cushion compress under me, like a quiet accusation. The envelope inside my Bible lay against my knee. I could feel its corner through the thin leather cover, the hard angle of a check. It felt like a stone. When Pastor Bennett spoke, his words about new doors and community growth fluttered over me like winter birds. He spoke with that practiced warmth, the smile that bends at the edges. His hands moved easily, open, inviting. But his eyes kept sliding past me to a man in a gray suit who was nodding, eyes fixed on the architect's drawings folded across his lap. I watched the way the pastor softened when he reached the mayor. There was a language in the bend of his shoulder I had never heard in a sermon. The organ rose into the offering hymn. My hand went to my Bible without thinking. My fingers brushed the envelope. I smelled paper and old glue. The music filled the rafters, the notes wrapping around the gilt of the pulpit. For a second I imagined the sanctuary as it had been when Harold and I first came. Warm breath, candle wax, the smell of hot coffee after a potluck. That memory held me for a breath. Then it slipped away. I caught the mayor whispering to the pastor, a small deliberate murmur. They smiled. Their shoulders moved as if sharing a secret. The pew where I had sat for decades was being offered like a favor, an image for the papers. And the offer, I realized with a cold clarity, had nothing to do with preserving our history. When the congregation began to file out, I stayed. The sound of footsteps softened into murmurs, then the door closing, soft click, like a punctuation mark. Warm afternoon light came through the stained glass and painted the aisle in fractured colors. I let the sun warm my hands, and I felt my breath settle into a steadier rhythm. Rebecca slipped into the bench beside me. She didn't touch my hand. She didn't need to. Her voice was small. I know what you had planned today. There was no judgment in it, only a careful, wet concern like the smell of rain against hot pavement. I unfolded my thumb from around the envelope and felt the paper's edge. Jennifer is good with this kind of thing, I said. My voice was steadier than I felt. She does preservation work in Boston. She knows how to protect places like this. Rebecca's eyes flicked toward the front, where the pastor and the mayor were talking beside the exit. The pastor's laugh cut the air, a sound like fine crystal. He clasped the mayor's hand twice. As I rose to leave, the envelope slid back into my Bible. The leather felt familiar, warm from my hands. Pastor Bennett turned and saw me at the aisle. Eleanor. So good to see you. Good to see you too, Pastor, I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried. I felt the pulse at my throat, steady and certain. Today gave me clarity. Outside, the light hit the old stone and warmed it. The stained glass cast its last colors across my shoes. For 72 years this place had been the measure of my life. Walking out, I felt the weight of the envelope like a promise, and like a challenge. I walked to my car with the check folded safe in my bag. The engine hummed under my hands. I dialed Jennifer's number with fingers that trembled less than they had in the pew. The phone rang, and the summer air smelled like cut grass and the threat of rain. I said her name. It's time, I told her. My voice sounded like the closing of a door. The silence hit like a hand over my mouth. One moment the sanctuary was quiet in that way it always is before the minister's words. Hushed breaths, the soft rustle of hymnals. Then Pastor Bennett raised his hand and nodded toward Thomas. I felt every head turn. My fingers tightened on my handbag until the leather creaked. The pearls at my throat felt suddenly heavy like small, accusing weights. My dears, thank you for sitting with me today. I'm so grateful for your time. This channel is still finding its feet, and every new subscriber means the world. We're aiming for our first 1,000. If this story touches you, please hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. It makes me feel less alone out here. I remember the morning clearly. Light pouring across the kitchen counter, coffee steam, the faint scent of cinnamon from a roll I'd baked. I smoothed my navy dress, clipped on the pearls Harold gave me, and lifted my old leather Bible from the shelf where his paperbacks used to be stacked. For a beat, the house felt like a place that held us both. Cedar closet, Harold shirts, the quiet hum of a life stretched out over decades. Church felt like the same kind of refuge. I'd been sitting in that front pew for 72 years. Harold and I baptized Jennifer there. We held our breath when our son shipped off to the service. We buried neighbors and friends and finally, Harold himself beneath that roof. The wood had the memory of our hands in its grain. So when Thomas shuffled toward me, bent and apologetic, my immediate reaction was confusion. Mrs. Davidson, we need you to move back today, he said, soft, with his eyes flicking to the front. It landed like a weight. I heard the rustle of pages, the small intake of breath from whoever sat behind me. Thomas's hesitation was obvious. His mouth wanted to say more, but his shoulders told me he had been given instructions. But my voice broke. Names and years tumbled through me like a photo album. But this is my seat. He looked almost ashamed. Orders from the pastor, the mayor and some investors. They need these seats today. They need these seats. The words were precise, clinical, as if a pew could be traded like a centerpiece. Behind Thomas, Pastor Bennett moved with that practiced warmth. Hands open, a smile that had learned how to light up a room. He greeted Mayor Collins like a returning ally, slapping his back and gesturing toward the altar as if it were a stage for their photo op. I stood, each step down the aisle stretching like a country road. Stained glass threw color over my shoulder, wood warmed under my palm where I steadied myself. Faces turned. Some softened with pity, some looked away. I caught Susan Williams glancing, her mouth. His sermon that morning circled around new doors and blessings. The irony tasted bitter. At the offering hymn I felt the envelope's corner through the leather of my Bible. The organ swelled. I let the notes wash over me and tried not to think. But when the mayor and the pastor shared a whispered laugh, their shoulders toward each other like conspirators, everything slotted into place. This wasn't about restoration for the congregation. I realized then that the plan whispered in those drawings involved demolishing part of the old structure, making room for parking for access to the proposed shopping center. The sanctuary that had sheltered generations would be compromised for commerce. My chest tightened so hard I thought I might have an asthma attack. The pew I'd given my Sundays to was now an asset on a page. People filed out. Conversations bloomed into the courtyard air. I stayed seated. The afternoon sun warmed the worn stone and the stained glass painted the floor in fractured jewel tones. Pastor Bennett chatted with the mayor near the door, hands animated, the sort of easy laugh that had always made me trust him. He didn't notice me at first. Rebecca slipped into the bench, quiet as a moth. "I know what you were going to do," she said, voice small, honest. There was no outrage, just a tight sympathy. I pulled the envelope free and looked at it. For a moment I simply watched the ink numbers, the bank seal. "Jennifer knows preservation law," I told Rebecca. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "She'll know what needs to be done. She works in Boston, she's seen this before. We can stop them." When I stood to leave I felt every eye like a weather vane. Pastor Bennett turned and smiled that practiced smile. "Eleanor, hope the service blessed you today." "It gave me clarity," I answered. And for the first time in a long time my voice did not tremble. The words landed plain and firm. Out on the steps, the late light made the old stones glow. I walked to my car with the envelope safe in my bag. The engine hummed. I dialed Jennifer. The summer air smelled of cut grass and threatened rain. Her voice on the line steadied me. "It's time," I said. My hands had stopped shaking. My faith felt smaller and yet truer, separate from the building, rooted in the people and the truth of what we had promised each other. The church was worth more than a photo op. It was worth a fight. A few hours before the sanctuary swallowed me with its hush, I was standing at my kitchen window watching the morning unfurl. The light came in thin and clean, slipping across the counter like a promise. The kettle hissed. Coffee smelled black and kind, a little like the old morning's Harold and I used to share before he got sick. Cinnamon from the roll I'd baked the night before curled into the air, and for a heartbeat the house felt like the safe, small world we had built together. I'm 72 now, widow for 3 years. I still fold Harold's shirts the way he liked them, and sometimes I find myself setting an extra place at the table out of habit. People around town know me as the woman who brings pies to funerals, who sews the costumes for the Christmas pageant, who collects for the organist's tuition and waters the hydrangeas by the church sign. The church is stitched through my life like a seam. Every Sunday a stitch, every prayer a thread. On the hall table lay the bank letter. I'd opened it 2 weeks earlier with my hands that still remember the farm's work. There was a figure on the page that made the room tilt. $250,000. Harold's insurance and the sale of the old field. I read it twice. Then I folded it in on itself like a map and sat very still. I thought of the leaking heater in February, of the warped pews that pinched knees, of the way the organ wheezed on cold mornings. I thought simply, this is how I will say thank you. I set the check in a plain envelope and slid it into my Bible. That leather cover has a story pressed into it. Harold's thumbprint at the edge, the smudge from the funeral bulletin the year I lost my sister. It felt heavier than a piece of paper. It felt like a promise I hadn't known I needed to make. I put on my navy dress, the one Harold said made me look steady, and fastened the pearls around my throat. The pearls were from our 40th, soft and warm against my skin, and they always make me stand straighter. I glanced once at the cedar closet where his jackets hang, and then locked the door and walked up the lane toward church. The bells were tolling as I approached. 3 slow peals that shook the air and the leaves. The sound always sends a little shiver through me. It means the world is in its place for a moment. Inside the sanctuary, everything looks the same at a glance. The brass cross on the altar polished by the Thursday ladies, the choir hymnals lined like little rowboats, the red curtain behind the pulpit hanging heavy and dignified. That curtain, a deep burgundy, seems to soak up light and keep the room warm with tradition. On the altar, a small embroidered cloth with faded gold thread always catches my eye. Someone's careful stitchwork from decades ago. A quiet hand that kept the place tender. Near the front, there is a pew that is often empty on purpose. No plaque or sign, just an empty gap by the aisle where visitors sometimes sit, or where we set out a donation basket for someone in need. When Harold and I were first married, we sat in that very front pew on the left. We watched so many things happen from there. Jennifer's baptism when she was only a skinny child with cold feet. The school plays where Harold pretended not to cry when the nativity star fell. The night friends stood with us after a neighbor's funeral. The wood has a warmth there from the years of hands, and I know the dense and smoothed places like family. I thought that morning about Pastor Bennett. He's been our pastor for more years than I care to count. He has dined at our kitchen table, accepted my apple pie at committee meetings, and told stories about his mother's roses when he wanted us to feel close. He speaks kindly in public. People trust him. I trusted him enough that when I signed the check in my head, I pictured him taking my hand and saying something about stewardship and legacy. I pictured the congregation leaning forward like a single breath, grateful and steady. There was also Thomas' old shoulders, careful steps, that shy way he always has of apologizing without saying the word. He has a man's hands from a lifetime at the mill, and a limp that makes him slow on the stairs. He once helped Harold fix the roof during a windstorm. He is the kind of man who does the small, necessary things and expects no reward. As I packed the envelope into my handbag, the church air seemed thicker than usual. I noticed the organist's bench, where Rebecca always pulls at the leather with a practice slide, and the small where her knees touch when she plays. The building itself smells of beeswax and old varnish, of hymnals and winter coats. Light from the stained glass painted the floor in shards of color. An empty pew near the side felt like a punctuation mark, a silent question waiting in the room. I remember thinking, almost absent-mindedly, that traditions sit beside possibility, and sometimes they need a little tending. I left the house with my hand on the envelope. I didn't suspect how many hands would touch that same morning, or how hands that once shook mine in comfort might now move me aside. I only knew then that giving felt like closing a circle. I thought of Harold's laugh and felt, for a moment, the whole thing fitting right back together. The hush in the sanctuary folded over me like a palm. One breath, the room was that familiar, waiting quiet, the rustle of hymnals, the soft scrape of shoe soles. Then Pastor Bennett lifted his hand and nodded toward Thomas. All at once every head turned. My fingers tightened around my handbag until the leather complained. The pearls at my throat felt heavy like weights. I remember the morning in small, bright pieces. Sunlight on the kitchen counter, the kettle hissing, the faint cinnamon from the roll I'd baked. I smoothed my navy dress, clipped on Harold's pearls, tucked the leather-bound Bible under my arm. The envelope with the check was folded inside like a small secret flame. $250,000. Harold's insurance and the sale of the farm. I had pictured that money warm in the hands of this church, new pews, a working heater, a safer roof. I had imagined hands clasping mine. Then Thomas came down the aisle with that slow shuffling step. You could see the apology in the stoop of his shoulders. He bent and whispered, but his whisper carried. Mrs. Davidson, we need you to move back today. The words landed in my chest like a stone. My heart turned over. My palms went cool and slick. For a moment my knees forgot how to hold me. I heard the organist breathe in, a single note hovering like a question. But, I started. My voice dissolved. For 72 years I'd sat in that front pew. Harold and I baptized. The aisle felt endless. The stained glass threw shards of colored light across my cheek. Each step made the floorboards remember Harold's heavier stride. At the back, the smell of damp coats and wool pressed against my face. I sat among teenagers whose lives were still wide open. The envelope pressed under the leather of my Bible like a truth I couldn't swallow. Pastor Bennett stood at the front with that practiced warmth, his smile the same that had comforted us at funerals and weddings. He moved easily into the mayor's orbit, handshakes, the soft pat on the back. Mayor Collins had that political grin, the kind that belonged to campaign photos and press releases. He produced folded drawings, slid them to the man in the pulpit, and the pastor's eyes lit up in a way they never had for a hymn. The sermon drifted over me. Talk of new doors, blessings, a future so bright it didn't seem to need the past. His hands were open, but his gaze kept flicking to the mayor, to the sketches of straight lines and parking spaces. I found myself tracing the grain of the pew under my fingers, tasting varnish and old coffee. A quiet realization edged into me. What they were planning wasn't restoration for the congregation. It was a trade. A partial gutting of the old building to make room for parking, for access to a proposed shopping center. A compromise of the sanctuary's bones for someone else's profit. My throat tightened. My breath hitched and came out shallow. I could feel that hot rising flush on my face, humiliation and more like grief with an edge. The offer of my check, the very thing I had brought to say thanks, suddenly felt like bait. The pew I'd held sacred was being used as a backdrop for a photo opportunity. When the congregation began to file out, voices blooming and folding into the courtyard air, I remained. The laughter and small talk moved around me like a stream. I let the sunlight warm my hands and felt the envelope's corner beneath the Bible. My fingers closed over it until the paper trembled. Rebecca slipped into the bench beside me. She didn't need to speak loud. "I know what you were going to do," she said, and there was no accusation, only a delicate, worrying compassion. I thought of Jennifer in Boston, her steady voice on the other end of our long talks, her necklaces of keys and folders filled with preservation plans. She worked with old buildings. She knew how to turn words into protection. My hands were still shaking, but a new steadiness grew in my chest, like the slow setting of concrete. "I'll call her tonight," I told Rebecca. "She'll know what to do." The decision felt like stepping onto a porch after a storm. Shame had been the first impulse, hurt and the desire to shrink, but the shame was not mine to keep. This place had sheltered generations. It was not a prop for headlines. I smoothed the leather of my Bible and slid the envelope back into its fold. I would not hand it over under a smile and camera light intended to paper over what they planned to take. As I rose, Pastor Bennett turned and saw me at the aisle. "Eleanor, so good to see you," he began, and his voice was the same practiced warmth that had once felt like home. "It gave me clarity," I said, and surprised myself with how steady my voice sounded. The words landed plain and sure. Outside, the late light warmed the stone and the stained glass flung colors across the steps. I walked to my car with the check folded safe in my bag. The engine hummed. I dialed Jennifer with hands that steadied as the phone rang. The summer air smelled like cut grass and rain coming. "It's time," I told her when she answered. My breath evened out. The humiliation that had pressed at me all morning shifted into something else, resolve. My faith bent but did not break. If they wanted a fight for the heart of this place, then I would take it. I would make sure the church that had cradled my life for 72 years wasn't traded for a parking lot and a photograph. The pew felt emptier than it looked. I kept my hand flat on the wood as if I could read the years in its grain. Each ridge was a Sunday, Harold's elbow dent, the faint burn where someone once set down a hot coffee, a child's scuffed shoelace. Those photographs of my life live in texture. I press my thumb against one and it trembles. Thomas shuffled back toward the front as if the aisle itself had weight he was carrying. He paused within reach and his eyes would not meet mine. His mouth opened once, closed. He folded his hands the way he had when he prayed at Harold's funeral, big, work-calloused hands that never looked right in dress gloves. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Davidson," he said finally, and the apology landed like a small paper boat on a wide, indifferent river. He kept his voice low, but I could hear the quiver. Behind him, the pastor laughed too loudly at something the mayor said. The laugh had the hollow ring of a bell that's lost its clapper. "It's not you, Thomas," I said. My voice was smaller than I intended. I watched him from under the brim of my hat. His chin trembled almost imperceptibly. He glanced at the pastor, then away like a man avoiding two fires. He swallowed. If it were any different," his words dissolved. He reached out and touched the corner of my purse as if to fix the strap. The gesture was absurdly intimate and clumsy. You could see the guilt in the way his shoulders drooped afterward, like a coat that had been too long on a peg. Rebecca sat a pew behind me, hands folded in her lap, the small brooch in the shape of a musical note catching the light. She had come up behind me during the hymn. Now she leaned in close enough for me to feel the whisper of her sleeve. "I heard them talking about the site plan during choir practice," she murmured. Her breath smelled faintly of peppermint. "The drawings they show removing the east wing for parking." Her eyes darted to the front where the pastor and the mayor were still talking, then back to me. "They want the photo op. They want the donors to be seen blessing it." She said donors as if it were a neat little label you stick on something too big to manage. I thought of Harold's hands on a plow, of the acres that gave us our quiet and later, the money that would let this roof keep out the winter. Images came like slides. Harold laughing with flour on his cheek while we rolled pie crust, Jennifer's knees splashing in the baptismal water, the procession at Mr. Calder's funeral when everyone pressed in close. I could smell cinnamon and Sunday gravy, hear the rough laugh of men from the mill, see the cross-stitched altar cloth my mother made. Each memory was a photograph, frayed at the edges but true. Rebecca touched my arm, a small steady pressure. "You don't have to decide here," she said. There was no pity in it, only a hand offered. When I rose to leave, the sanctuary felt slippery with other people's plans. Pastor Bennett stepped into my path with the airy ease of someone who has rehearsed compassion. He held out his hand as if to bless, his other hand tucked into the pocket where his phone probably sat. Messages waiting. "Eleanor, so glad you could be with us today," he said, his smile folding around his words like paper around a gift. His perfume smelled faintly of cedar and something clean. Up close you could see the neatness in his collar, the way his cufflinks caught the light. I watched his face for the micromotion of recognition. Did he feel the small quake he'd caused? He did not. "It was good to be here," I answered. I held his gaze until he shifted, the smallest flicker of discomfort passing under his practiced calm. "Pastor, I brought something I wanted to give. For the pews, for the heating." The sentence trembled and then steadied. I felt the envelope heavy in my bag like a heart. His fingers hesitated near mine. For a second his hand softened, like a man deciding whether to clasp or to hold apart. He looked very briefly toward the mayor at the door and then back to me. "Eleanor, you're so generous," he said, palms spreading in that familiar orator's gesture. "We'll discuss this with our benefactors, and we can find a time to recognize your gift." Recognize. A neat word that parachuted into place where my name should have sat. It was the pastor's version of saying later. The mayor's laugh drifted from near the vestibule, a polite burst. There was a camera in the air that hadn't yet been taken out of its case. I folded my hand over his briefly, an old human thing, and felt the warmth of his palm. There was a gap though where trust used to be. It felt like standing in a doorway and a wind coming through you. "I'll be attending to other matters," I said, and left the best of my tone for the door. Outside, the sun hit the stone and the stained glass threw colors at my shoes, petals across concrete. The air smelled of. I sat there a moment longer and let the engine hum under me. The church was still standing, stone-stained glass, the faint smell of beeswax in the air. They could gather for their photos, they could pat each other on the back. But those photographs were flat. My memories are not. I folded my fingers around the envelope and felt something change inside me. I would not be moved like a prop. Not today. Not ever. The days after that Sunday felt like waking into a town that had learned a new habit of looking away. At first it was small things. An interrupted sentence when I passed the church hall after potluck, a plate set down a beat too early as if someone had rehearsed the motion to avoid offering me the last piece of pie. The air smelled the same, coffee, lemon oil on the folding tables, the faint, comforting dust of hymnals, but the way people moved around me changed. They made space that felt less like courtesy and more like a cordon. I went to the bakery because I always get a sticky roll to steady myself on mornings that feel too large. Susan stood behind the counter, flour on her forearms like a badge from years of volunteering. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. When she reached to hand me the roll, her arm stopped. Her hand hovered, then pulled back. "Oh, Mrs. Davidson, we're..." She turned and wrapped the paper in a way that kept the exchange formal, like a transaction you don't want to touch. I tasted cinnamon and a thinness of loss. At the post office, the clerk who had once asked after Harold's health slid my slip back across the counter with a whisper. Two women in line glanced at my navy dress, then at their shoes. They tightened their scarves as if preparing for wind. I felt a dozen small judgments press into the skin of my shoulders like tiny precise pinpricks. Someone let out a laugh that was too sharp and too loud for the space, and everyone smiled at it like they'd been given permission to move on. The first clear cut came at coffee hour after Wednesday Bible study. I arrived with my thermos and a dish of lemon squares, my usual, hoping to sit where the circle of folding chairs made a soft promise of welcome. The room cooled as I opened the door. Heads turned, then tilted away. Darlene caught sight of me and shuffled behind a stack of hymnals, using them as a shield. She pretended to look up an impossible hymn number. Susan pretended not to see my hand wave. The women who used to press their palms into mine when my hands trembled now folded their hands into their laps and looked at the tablecloth. Thomas, bless him, came over, his steps that same slow shuffling pace. He kept his eyes down as if avoiding the weight of the air. He reached out once, as if to tuck a stray strand of hair behind my ear. Then he stopped as if remembering he was not permitted to bridge certain distances. He began, and the apology hung unfinished like a hymn that never found its last chord. I held my lemon squares until someone reached for one. No one did. The coffee grew cold in the pot. The organist's widow, who used to sit next to me and knit during recitals, told me she had an appointment and gathered her bag as if rehearsing an exit. A teenager, one of the choir kids, stood by the door, eyes fixed on his phone, and slipped past me without a hello. Small doors closed. Big doors swung and didn't wait. Whispers followed in waves. In the grocery aisle, the woman with the PTA folder lowered her voice to a mere breeze when she saw me selecting canned tomatoes. At the hardware store, the clerk who'd once asked for my advice on a paint color suddenly had urgent deliveries to check. At the community garden, a group of volunteers cleared a plot precisely where I planned to kneel to weed and moved further down the row as if cooperating on an unspoken choreography of avoidance. Sometimes the looks were almost tender, soft concern that folded right back to distance. Other times they were sharp, like lines drawn to mark territories. Someone had told a story that changed my face into an emblem. People walked into rooms and closed them behind them before I could enter. One evening, I walked up to the church social expecting the friendly chaos of folding chairs and casseroles. The door was latched from the inside. The sign on the door read Fellowship Night, closed to set up. No one answered when I knocked. The latch clicked like a tiny bell. It hurt in a way that surprised me. Not just the hot flare of embarrassment, but a slow bruising. I had been the woman who sewed costumes, who drove neighbors to appointments, who brought soup when a family was sick. My hands had fixed the altar cloth more times than I could count. To be made into an object of silence felt like someone cutting threads out of a quilt. Rebecca, bless her again, saw the change the same week. She appeared at my door carrying a stack of choir sheet music and a face that looked as if she had been up all night with worry. She would not let me be swallowed by the hush. People are nervous, she said, direct as a note in a scale. There's talk at the diner. Mayor Collins is pushing a project. They're scared of what it might mean for their donations, their jobs. It's like the town is being asked to choose sides. Her voice was small but clear. She sat with me on my porch and listened as I described the way faces had closed like shutters. She told me the mayor had been seen at the Rotary Club, and that the pastor had taken his calls with a kind of eager deference. It's influence, she said. People see where the wind is blowing and they bend. It's not you they're afraid of. They're afraid of being swept up. The isolation grew like ivy, slow at first, then confident, sliding into places you didn't expect. Friendships thinned into polite nods. Invitations stopped. The church bulletin, once printed with my name under volunteer, now seemed to skip the space where mine would have been. And yet, in those tight places of distance, a decision settled in me like a seed finding soil. Each quieted doorway pushed me to call my daughter sooner, to gather the papers and the photos, to begin the work of making the story of this place larger than polite avoidance. They could close doors. They could try to make me invisible in my own town. But I was not a photograph to be moved to a better light. I had memories with the heft of years and an envelope that still lived safely in my bag. The more they turned away, the clearer my direction became. I would not let the silence be the last word. The moment sharpened like a bell. Pastor Bennett's voice filled the sanctuary. Smooth, practiced, the kind of cadence that made people lean forward without thinking. The organ hummed beneath him, a low, steady note that seemed to hold the room together. I had my hands clasped so tightly in my lap my knuckles stung. I could feel the envelope through the leather of my Bible. A small folded weight that had once felt like a benediction. Now it felt like an accusation. He spoke about new doors again, about blessing and vision, words that until that morning had been balm. The varnished wood of the pulpit smelled of lemon oil and sweat and a kind of sacred polish. The scent rose up and made me think of the times Harold and I polished chairs after potluck, how the rubbing made us quiet in a good way. Today the smell made my throat tight. Thomas had retreated to the front, hands folded, eyes pressed politely to the hymn book. He looked like a man trying to hold two truths in his chest. Beside him, Mayor Collins leaned in, his jacket creasing with an architect's slay of paper. The pastor's smile softened at him in a way it hadn't softened for me. I watched that small tilt of his shoulder. The recognition of money and influence. The sanctuary seemed suddenly smaller. I breathed in slowly, deliberately. In, out. The kind of breathing they teach in classes for grief. The kind you do when you are trying not to make a scene. My fingers found each other and braided. The old habit of my mother. Interlaced like rosary beads without the beads. My pulse was a drum in my wrists. Every so often I pinched the leather of the Bible so hard the gold edge of the check felt like a coin pressed against my palm. The organist swelled a chord and the rafters whispered. There was a candle on the altar, one of the thin tapered ones they light for small services. Its flame had been steady all morning, a tiny faithful light. A draft moved through the sanctuary when a side door opened too long for a greeting, and the candle leaned. For a heartbeat the wick shivered like a voice about to break. Then the flame winked out and smoke curled up, thin and unassuming as if embarrassed. People glanced up for a breath, then looked away. The small extinguishing felt like a punctuation mark. Pastor Bennett's words turned to thanks for visionary partners, who would help the church step into the future. He gestured toward the mayor as if introducing a benefactor. The mayor's hand found the pastor's shoulder, and they shared a laugh that was just breath and habit. They were photographing an idea already framed. A door at the side creaked open, a small ordinary sound that became a drumbeat in my bones. Whispers grew like paper being ruffled. Faces that had been warm and familiar hardened into masks of convenience. Susan looked down at her hands as if they had offended her. Darlene reached for her purse like a prayer. Rebecca's mouth opened and closed. Her fingers tightened around the hymn book and I saw the white of them. For a moment I imagined the check burning in my hand. I tasted metal, like the coins we used to drop in Harold's palm when we paid the farmer down the lane. My breath shortened and then I caught myself. No, I thought. Not like this. Not under a smile and a photograph. When the offering plate came round, time narrowed to the heartbeat between two notes. I could feel my breath like a held coin. I lifted my Bible as if to open it, my thumb brushing the paper edge of the envelope. The plate hovered before me and the organ rose with the hymn. For a second the whole room was sound. The swish of skirts, the soft cough of someone with a tickle, the rustle of pages. My fingers hovered. And then I saw Pastor Bennett lean toward the mayor, whisper something quick, the kind of small consultation that realigns priorities. The mayor's eyes flicked to the drawing in his lap, then back to the pastor, and they both smiled with the kind of complicity that excludes the rest of the room. The pastor's gaze skirted over the pews, finding the faces that would look good for the paper. Something in me unclipped. Shame had been fast and hot, I'll not deny it, but it was not the only thing there. There was also a cold, precise clarity like sunlight through a crack. The church was not only a building. It was memory and promise and the quiet hands that had kept it going. It was not for sale as a backdrop. I stood up deliberately. The bench gasped like a held breath released. My hands came free of each other and I placed the Bible against my chest. My voice surprised me by not trembling. "Pastor," I said, and the room condensed to that single syllable. His practiced smile faltered in the same almost instant that the crucifix's shadow fell across his shoes. He turned, measured me with that same courteous expression he'd given donors all morning. "Eleanor," he began, the word like a rehearsed bridge. "It gave me clarity," I said. The sentence landed like a stone on still water. My voice was steadier than I felt. The murmurs rose and fell like small waves. I saw the cameras in the heads of people, some already composing the image they wanted to keep. For a moment his mouth was a thin line. Thomas looked like a man who wished he could undo the morning. The mayor's practiced smile thinned. Rebecca's eyes were two clear notes of astonishment and relief. I pressed my hand into my bag, the envelope warm and unspent. The wooden floorboard under my shoe hummed with the echo of Harold's steps. I did not hand it over. I did not bow or bend. I let the door creak open behind me as I walked out, the sound like a choice made audible. Outside, the late light felt honest and painfully clear. The smoke from the candle had drifted up into the rafters, leaving a small telling stain. The crucifix lay silent inside. My hands had stopped shaking. The clarity I felt was not tidy. It was a steady, uncomfortable brightness. But it was mine. I drove home with the envelope like a small hot stone against my ribs. The town felt the same, porches, the post office bell, the bakery with its little bell. But things had shifted as if someone had tilted the map ever so slightly. When Jennifer arrived the next morning, she stepped out of her rental car with mud on her boots, and a city cadence that somehow steadied me. We sat at my kitchen table with the Bible between us. Her city voice was practical, not angry, just efficient. "We can put in an emergency nomination with the Historic Commission," she said, flipping through a notepad. "Photographs, any paperwork that shows continuous use, proof of ownership, and—" She looked up then, softening. "Mom, do you have anything else? Notes? Emails? Anything that proves they were planning structural change?" I hesitated and then told her the truth. The way Pastor Bennett had smiled at the drawings, the mayor's folded papers, Thomas's apology. I told her about Rebecca's whisper in the pew. Jennifer listened, thumb running a pencil along the edge of the check, like it was a ruler marking a decision. People talk, she said. But talk only goes so far. We need something that lives on paper. We left a message at the church, thinking perhaps someone would be honest. Later that afternoon, as I brewed tea and tried to steady my hands, Thomas came by the back door. His coat was threadbare at the elbow, the same tired brown he's worn for years. He carried something wrapped in brown paper. "I don't want any trouble, Mrs. Davidson," he started, and his voice was the kind that takes small breaths as if saving air for prayer. He sat at my kitchen table as if he had been given permission to enter a sanctuary of a different sort. He unfolded the paper with fingers that shook slightly. Inside were prints, copies of site plans, notes in a hand I recognized from the church office, a list of donor names and a handwritten line that made my stomach fall. East wing to be removed for parking. Photo op with mayor with donors in front pews. Thomas's eyes met mine. I was asked to seat them up front. The pastor. He told me it was important for the future. I didn't like it. He swallowed. I kept these. I thought maybe I'd hide them, but they wouldn't leave my head. It was not a confession in a great wave. It was a small, honest letting go. The sort of thing that, once out, rearranges a room. The documents were not dramatic, no smoking gun of corruption, but they told a clear, steady truth. Plans existed and conversations had been had in ink and print. Enough, Jennifer said, to begin. We took photographs. Rebecca came over with her camera. She had been watching me from the back row like a quiet sentinel, and stood with us as we recorded each page. Her brooch flashed when she moved. It was a small human thing of music in a house full of blue light. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. That evening we walked into the Historic Commission office together. The clerk frowned, ordered us copies, and told us to come back the next morning. It was the slow machinery of officialdom, paper, stamps, signatures, but it felt like progress. We filed the emergency nomination, stapled photographs, and left with a receipt like a promise. The first little victory was procedural and therefore unromantic. A temporary stay on any demolition discussions. A small purple stamp on a thin sheet of paper. But when it came through, I sat on my porch step and felt something unclench inside me. People began to look at me differently, not with the cold, rehearsed avoidance I'd felt after Sunday, but with an alertness that asked questions. Word traveled. Not everyone rallied. The town is not a choir that always sings in unison. There were meetings with raised voices, coffees at the diner where plates slid across the table, as people argued about progress and preservation. Pastor Bennett called, his tone smooth as always, offering platitudes that landed flat. The mayor sent a press release about forward-thinking partnerships. The headlines were careful, but there were also neighbors who brought casseroles, who stopped on the street and placed a hand over mine. Rebecca sat with me for hours and we went through old photographs, baptismal slips, the program from Harold's funeral, an old membership ledger with dates and signatures. Jennifer drafted a letter to the local paper outlining the church's significance. Thomas, who had seemed to shrink into regret, stood in a town hall meeting and read the handwritten note he had found, voice cracking on a few words. He did not blame anyone. He told a truth about being torn. The shift was not cinematic. It was made of small things. A pause in a conversation, a hand that stayed when most would withdraw, a camera flash that did not only aim for the mayor but for the building itself. I sat through a hearing and watched the commission members nod, their pens marking boxes that would make what we feared harder to simply sweep away. Emotionally, the change was quieter. I had started that Sunday humiliated, feeling like a relic pushed into shadow. The books on my shelf, the photos in my purse, the smell of lemon oil in the pews. These things were not extinguished by a smile and a photograph. When the temporary hold came through, I felt my breath go deep and slow like a tide coming in. I did not hand over the check. That felt right and necessary. Not in spite of faith but because of it. Faith, I realized. The first quiet after the hearing felt like a held breath being let go. We had won a small bureaucratic thing, a stamp, a stay, a pause that bought the church time. It was not a victory parade. It was paper and signatures and a clerk who tapped a rubber stamp a little too hard. But when that purple mark landed on the page, I felt the tightness in my chest loosen by the width of an old hymn page. People began to look at me differently. Not with the practiced politeness that once kept conversations shallow, but with a curiosity edged in shame or hope, sometimes both. Neighbors brought casseroles again, but this time their hands did not tremble when they set the dishes down. Thomas came by more often, bringing small things he thought I might need. A jar of pickles Harold used to like, a shop-worn flashlight, a single daisy from the community garden. He never stayed long. He always left with the air of a man carrying a small private penance. Rebecca kept the camera she'd used to document the documents. She would sit on my porch steps and we would look through old photos, Polaroids browned at the edges, program booklets with names someone had written in a careful cursive I could still read. She had a way of making small sounds that meant I'm here. When she laughed it was almost apologetic, like she was surprised to find joy growing out of all this dust. Jennifer came down from Boston and walked the halls with me, her sensible shoes scuffing in rhythm with my heartbeat. She taught me how to file a form without sounding like a stranger to the world. We did not become a town of saints overnight. There were still dinners where eyes slid past me. There were people who said that progress had to be painful and that history sometimes got in the way of jobs and growth. I listened. I argued. I cried. I mended. I did what I have always done. Stitching, pressing, smoothing the rough hems of other people's lives so that they might go on without noticing my hands. The envelope, my envelope with the check, has changed weight in my bag. It is no longer a certificate of surrender. It is a tool now, something to be wielded with thought. We set it aside and used it differently. Photographs were taken, funds were shifted to a legal trust, small grants were applied for repair work that could not wait. I discovered that generosity is as much about timing as it is about amount. There are moments when giving is an embrace, and others when it would be a blindfold. Pastor Bennett called twice. His voice was that practiced, well-kept thing he has always used to smooth edges. I listened and answered politely. Sometimes faith asks for patience. Sometimes it asks for reckoning. I chose the latter. He didn't apologize the way a person humbled by grief apologizes. He made offers that smelled of press releases. I refused most of them. He still walks the aisle on Sundays. I still sit in the pews on those Sundays, not always the same ones. The church is a place for many kinds of people, and I am learning how to keep my place within that complicated map. At night I find myself sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of tea gone cold, the house smelling of lemon oil and old paper. I run my thumb along the seam of my Bible where the leather is worn thin. Sometimes I play with the pearls at my throat until they feel warm and familiar. Memory is a tactile thing for me. It sits between the threads of the altar cloth, in the dent of a pew, in the thin print of a program from a wedding we once hosted. There are small consolations. The organ has a new reed man working on it, a quiet man with wise fingers. He tuned it on a rainy morning and I stood at the back and listened until the chords settled into the rafters like a blessing. The crucifix that fell the Sunday of the meeting was repaired by someone who used to bring his children to Sunday school. He worked in silence, sanding and fastening, his hands steady as prayer. When he rehung it, he nodded to me without ceremony. That nod was worth more than any photograph the mayor could ever take. Sometimes when I walk through the sanctuary alone, I stop at the front pew, our pew, and run my fingers over the grain. There is a small dent where Harold used to brace his elbow. I press my thumb into it and the wood remembers our years. The light through the stained glass paints my hand in color, a fleeting stained memory. It is private and true. On a windy afternoon not long after the stay came through, I stood on the church steps watching people go about their business. A few teenagers sprinted past with a soccer ball, laughing like the whole world was a wide field. A woman crossed with a solar casserole dish, smiling. Thomas walked by on the sidewalk, his coat collar up against the wind. He tipped his head at me in a way that said, "We tried our best." I took one last look at the sanctuary doors before I got into my car. The varnished wood was warm from the sun. They had set a new padlock on the side door after the meeting, part protection, part symbol. I could see a pew through the window, empty and patient, its polish catching the light. For a long time I thought losing that front pew would mean losing myself. But then I realized the pew is not a single piece of wood. It is an idea, a pattern of care passed down by hands like mine. I closed my umbrella and walked down the steps. My shoes made small, soft sounds against the stone. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, a steady, ordinary drum. I walked to my car with the envelope in my bag and Jennifer on my mind, the town in my rear view, the hymn of our lives not yet finished. As I turned the key and the engine hummed awake, I heard the faint sound of footsteps behind me. They were singular at first, then multiplied into a soft chorus. Neighbors checking the mail, a child with a dog, someone closing a gate. The sound receded, folding itself into the street as if the town were breathing. A gust of wind came down the lane and caught the church door. It moved with that indiscriminate, gentle force the world has when it is rearranging things without permission. The door swung and then shut with a hollow, private thud. The sound landed somewhere between an ending and a promise. I drove away with the radio off and the windows down. The wind carried the smell of cut grass and rain, of lemon oil and old wood. Behind me the church rose as it always has, stone stain, and the deep, patient bow of a roof. In the rear view the front pew looked small and luminous through the window, empty and unassuming, waiting. There was dignity in the emptiness. There was also room. The footsteps faded, the door clicked, and for the first time in weeks I felt the shape of something starting. Not the kind of beginning that announces itself with banners, but the kind that grows by steady, stubborn acts of keeping. I pressed my thumb to the leather in my bag, feeling the small warm weight of a promise still unspent. Then I sighed and drove on. The days after the hearing felt like waking into the same town with different light. Morning still smelled of coffee and cinnamon rolls, the bakery bell still chimed, but the way people met my eyes had changed. Some turned them away, others held them a beat longer, as if trying to remember what had happened before the camera lights and the whispered plans. I learned how generosity could be complicated. The envelope in my bag was no longer a benediction to be handed over at the altar. It was a responsibility. Jennifer, calm and quick with the paperwork, taught me to photograph every corner of the sanctuary, to make lists, to gather names. "Don't hand them anything," she said, tapping the legal pad. "We'll use this to protect the building. We'll use your gift where it does the most good." Her city voice steadied me. Still does. Thomas came by the next week with those big, work-worn hands and something folded in brown paper. He set the bundle down like it weighed as much as his conscience. It was a set of copies, sketches, notes from meetings, a donor list with a single ugly line about removing the east wing for parking. He kept his eyes on his lap while I looked through each page, the ink a cold kind of proof. He didn't offer excuses. He apologized in the quiet way he always does, small, wooden, earnest. "I shouldn't have done it," he said. "But I couldn't. I just kept these." I took his hand. It was how I learned that courage sometimes wears the clothes of confession. Rebecca sat with me on my porch for hours, camera at her knee. She had taken the photos we needed. The carved dent where Harold used to brace his elbow, the scrawl of a choir member's name on an old bulletin, the rust pattern at the base of a pew that had weathered 100 winters. When she smiled, soft and surprised like a note resolved, there was a kind of relief in it I hadn't expected. She's young, and she still believes that things can be fixed by music and good light. Watching her sort the photos, I felt the story of the place become something visible again. There were small victories that felt almost silly to describe. A clerk at the Historic Commission stamped our papers with, "Not everyone forgave. Not everyone changed." Pastor Bennett still bowed his head at the pulpit. His voice still had that practiced warmth. He called a few times, offering carefully worded consolations that smelled faintly of PR. I listened. I answered politely, and I did not give him the envelope. The mayor issued his careful press release about vision and partnership. The headlines had their glossy photos. I learned that power wears a tidy suit and a practiced smile, and that those things do not always mean goodness. Faith shifted for me. It didn't break. If anything, it deepened into something quieter. I began to separate the altar from the institution. The church building holds more than sermons. It holds baptisms and funerals, the smell of lemon oil on a polishing cloth, the dent Harold made with his elbow. Those were the things worth keeping. I found that my prayers were less about consent and more about stewardship. I realized stewardship sometimes means holding back a gift until it will do the most good. We used the money with care. Instead of a single ceremonial check at a photo op, we placed funds where immediate repairs were needed. New slats for the pews that had splintered, heating pipes patched for winter, a small trust for long-term preservation. We agreed to place the bulk in a protected account overseen by a committee that included members who cared more for memory than for headlines. It felt right to put the dollars where they would keep the building whole, not make it more marketable. There were nights I sat at my kitchen table with the Bible open and the envelope beside my teacup. The leather was worn where my thumb had brushed it for years. The pearls at my throat felt warm. I could still smell lemon oil when I closed my eyes, and I could still see the way the stained glass threw color across the old wood. Pain and pride lived in the same place in my chest now, side by side. People came back in little ways. A casserole resettled on my stoop. Thomas dropped off a pickle jar Harold had loved. Rebecca left a taped recording of a hymn she'd played that morning. The sound of the organ filling my house like a friend. The crucifix that fell that Sunday was rehung by a man who had once brought his child to Sunday school. He worked without fuss and nodded at me when he was finished. That nod was small and true. The fight is not over. There will be meetings, letters, hearings I do not relish. There will be offers and counteroffers. And there will always be people who prefer a glossy photo to a long memory. But the sanctuary stands. The pews remember our hands. The stories are in the grain, and someone, sometimes many someones, still cares enough to look after them. When I press my thumb into Harold's old dent, I feel the years settle. The town is imperfect. So am I. But the thing I learned in the hush of that Sunday, when a hand moved me aside and a choice had to be made, was not about anger or victory. It was about dignity. It was about keeping promises even when no one is watching. Some things are not for sale. If you've made it this far, thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying until the end. If you feel it in your heart, please subscribe so you won't miss the next stories, and keep walking with me by watching the other videos I've prepared with care. And please, share in the comments what you thought of my testimony. I will read every word.